Be here today. I'm going to pull up my slides here really quickly so that we can get started. I appreciate your kind words, like I said, and today I look forward to talking to you guys about personality and about defense mechanisms, and really looking at how in recovery people can continue to struggle with many different types of things, and really understanding really understanding ourselves on a deeper level of what motivates us and why we engage in certain behaviors. I really hope to delve more into that, so just to broaden people's understanding of some of these underlying personality issues. So we're going to look at some developmental aspects and environmental factors that contribute to difficulties in personality. We're going to identify and discuss how it's difficult to change these patterns that we have ingrained for so long, and then look at some helpful ways to interrupt these in relationships with other people. So without further ado, we're going to start just looking at the development of the attorney personality. And I will say, just kind of getting started, I want you guys to know that I come and I work with professionals and have worked with professionals throughout my career. And I've also grown up in a house where my father was an attorney and judge, and now I'm married to an attorney. So I've pretty much lived with an attorney my entire life. So my expertise goes well beyond just the characteristics of things I've worked with at work. But you guys are a unique set of individuals, and there are lots of really great attributes that you bring to the table, and kind of understanding behind the scenes and things that help with the development of those things. I think it's really, really important to know. So some of you guys, or really all of you guys, are really the brightest of the bright. You're very intellectual, and you've known that probably your whole lives, and we're stars growing up, and you've been selected. There's a lot of you that have gone through really competitive lawyer or attorney law schools. You have worked really hard and been able to tolerate tons of pressure to be able to succeed and to abstain or to work through really difficult situations, and then to really face or really have these superhuman expectations to where you can fight through and meet expectations that most individuals would not have the capability to do. You mentioned, John, about the resilience. And I think that one thing that professionals don't understand, or that people that aren't professionals, that there really isn't, there's already a set of resilience that exists for professionals because you've been able to do all of these things. And sometimes people say, well, they just need to be more resilient. Attorneys need to be able to tolerate pressure more. And that's actually not the case. You guys have already know a lot of skills to be able to withstand pressure and to live up to expectations. And that resilience has paid off in many different ways, oftentimes. But how these characteristics really are part of you as a whole as attorneys. I really like this list of characteristics and strengths of attorneys. These are things that I pulled from several different places, but you guys really do have a passion for what you do, a passion for the law, a passion for the types of work that you do, and there's a willingness to fight for it, which is a unique strength and something that sometimes you can't find in many other types of work these days. There's a compassion and empathy for clients. And I think oftentimes when people talk about personalities of attorneys, this is not something that people hit on, but oftentimes when people go to law school, they go because they want to help. They want to help other people, and they have empathy. You're listening to stories day in and day out, and you're trying to find the unique intricacies of cases to be able to help people. You have excellent communication skills, where you can talk your way out of anything, which is usually very impressive. There's a willingness to listen, like I was saying before. You guys are constantly taking people's stories, and you're listening day in and day out to those stories, to where you're gaining deep insights into people's lives, into what's happened to them. And so there has to be a willingness in that to understand other people. The perseverance is very, very strong. Again, number one, to make it through the schooling that you've done in the law school, but your perseverance in your writing abilities and your ability to push through difficult situations when most people would just walk away. You guys are there to stick through it and to fight and to keep the ball rolling forward. And there's a real perseverance in you. Knowledge of the law is very, very self-explanatory. There's a creativity in you guys. And I think that's something you can make, take really small things and be able to creatively come up with ways to look at them in different manners and to present them to a judge in a different way that maybe are different light that somebody else hasn't thought of. And there has to be a real creativity to what the work that you're doing on a day in and day out basis. There has to be a strong ego. And we're going to talk about development of personality issues and some about ego and narcissism. But with your ego, I mean, an attorney cannot fall apart at the first sign of struggle, right? They have to be able to stand up for what they believe in. They have to be able to fight for what they believe in and what they are protecting or fighting for their client for. And so that strong ego is something that definitely comes into play and is something that's functional. Social ability, to be able to interact and be social and to create relationships and legacies of relationships is extremely important. The resilience we've talked about, the writing skills. And then this last one I always love to speak at and kind of poke at with attorneys. There's this healthy level of skepticism. And I will oftentimes laugh with attorneys coming in. They pick apart paperwork. They'll pick apart anything because of this skepticism, this kind of ability to look at something but have question about it. And oftentimes that is something that is valued and is a strength as an attorney. And we're going to look at sometimes how that can get in the way in relationships. But these are some really positive characteristics that attorneys have in their work. Now we look at this. I've got failure equals a lack of effort. And I think looking at with professionals and development of personality, oftentimes this is something that can happen for professionals where if I fail, and failure is usually a big fear of a lot of professionals, it means I'm not working hard enough. It means I need to just put in more effort. I need to persevere more and I need to push myself more. And so this is just one of those little things, and it's one of those mindsets that sometimes professionals get into and get stuck in. So that failure means I'm not working hard enough. And they're motivated out of fear of failure instead of feeling secure in who they are. Kind of looking at these, I've taken several strengths here and just looking at how when these positive things can start to go awry for personalities, where your passion at your work can mean that you never go home because you're constantly at work and you're burning both ends of the candle and not ever stepping away from your work to go home and be with family. The ego, where there's a healthy level of ego, but then getting to the place where you can never admit that you're wrong, right? That I have to win every argument. I can't allow anybody to see any weakness, and how that strength can become something that becomes problematic. The healthy skepticism, obviously it's something that you have to have as an attorney, but when it kind of bounces into this world of I can't trust anyone in relationships, and how that kind of gets too far out there, and I end up really hurting the relationships that I'm in because I don't trust anybody and I don't trust anything. The creativity can go awry when we start getting into manipulation and deceit, right? To where the ways that we're looking at creatively getting out of something ends up going too far into that deception of certain things. And then empathy of clients, making bad legal decisions because you care too much for your clients. So not really able to set boundaries, for example, and able to see what they need, and instead kind of get too far into it because you care so much for the client. And so looking at how these strengths of attorneys, when we get too far into them, they can start to go awry. So as I say all of that, leading into couple of slides just looking at personality disorders and what they are. I mean, I'm sure all of you have heard of personality disorders, and I love this slide right here. This is one I've had for many, many years, and it's very funny. But it looks at the different a parking lot of personality disorders. And you can see, like, for number 2 is the narcissist with the largest car and the prominent hood ornament. You've got the number 8, the obsessive compulsive personality with the perfect alignment in the parking spots. And the dependent number 3 that's attached to and has to feel sheltered. But this is just a funny overview of personality. And what I'm going to propose to you guys today is really looking at how personality, it's been looked at and is looked at as a disorder, but how these things are really just our strengths going awry. And so we're going to go into some of that now. And so what are personality disorders first? And we're going to start with just kind of understanding that. And personality, as you guys know, is the way we interact and how we interact with other people. And when it gets to that place where it's harmful in our relationships, it's getting far outside of what would be expected as normal. And so some people will say when you're interacting with somebody who's on that's got the level that it's harmful, that they will get to where they're really it's disruptive in the relationship and the way that they interact with other people. And there are many causes of personality problems, such as genetics or childhood trauma, verbal abuse, being highly reactive, or a lack of peers are some of the things that can cause these things. But as we go into this today, I want you to look at and kind of us view together. I'm gonna walk you through this to where you see these variants in personality as just extremes of the normal. And so, like I talked about with the strengths that you guys have. So when you look at ego, everybody needs a little ego. We have to have self-esteem, right? But when you start looking at narcissism, right, it's that extreme variant. It's when we start to use these personality traits in ways that end up hurting the relationships that we're in. So really, what causes that? And why do people tend to go towards the extremes, and why do people use those? So really, I want us to start here looking at the trauma. And I mentioned earlier in that slide that personality can be driven by trauma. And I believe it plays a huge role in how we decide to act in relationships and how we interact with others. And so you guys may have heard people describe big T's versus little T's. And traumas can be, most people, when they think about trauma, they think about the big T's. So they think about someone having experienced sexual abuse or a horrific car accident or a natural disaster. So those can be our big T's. And those are, I mean, for sure, those are traumas where a person was molested, for example, by a babysitter. But there are also these things called little T's. And I think oftentimes people have these happening all the time in their life and are growing up, and they really don't understand, or they think, well, that's just normal. That's just part of life. And they don't really kind of understand how that impacts the way that they then move on and develop in their relationships. And these little T's can be very small things that occur. They can be things like just an erratic, angry parent, or someone who was unpredictable as a child, to where, maybe one day mom is really nice, the next day mom is really mean, and really not knowing what to expect in the relationship. Those things can be little T's. Also, not knowing, kids need predictability, for example. And so not being able to predict what's happening at home. Mom and dad are really angry at each other one day, and then they're best friends the next day. For children, that's a really scary experience oftentimes, and they don't really understand that. And so those things can be lower level events that are still traumas. And so as we're kind of peeling back these things today, I want you guys to just kind of think about that in terms of maybe people or yourself didn't have big T's growing up, but maybe there were things that weren't ideal growing up that really did lead to maybe some defenses that ended up being developed in your relationships. this is one of the things that I think all of us need to understand, and it's called the window of tolerance. And when we look at when we kind of rely on maladaptive patterns, I think this is really helpful. Most of the time, we need to stay in this green zone, right? Which is the window of tolerance. When things are going well, we feel calm, we feel put together, we can engage mentally and emotionally in the relationship, and things aren't shaking us, right? However, when things happen that move us out of this window of tolerance to where we're feeling flooded, for example, or we're feeling overwhelmed, and our activation system, meaning like your heart rate, your emotional expression, or your emotional lability, can get in hyperaroused state, and it becomes overreactive. And I think looking at this, you may experience this or know people who do. It's like you can see it when they can no longer cope and they engage in some behavior that is harmful to them or harmful to the relationship. And so they engage in things that end up hurting other people or hurting themselves. And then this lower part is the hypoarousal. And that's when people are unmotivated, withdrawn. And some people can go into that and just shut down in emotional distress. But really what we're going to be looking at is sometimes in this hyperarousal, how we can engage in these maladaptive patterns that end up hurting us in relationships. So I'm looking at the role of defense mechanisms, and I kind of want to step back with you guys with the personality and help you see how with personality that we're developing, that sometimes these defenses, if you look at them from that window, can help protect us. So these personality characteristics, they're actually developmental sometimes and can be helpful. So what does that mean, a healthy defense mechanism? So looking here, that when people are looking at personality disorders these days and how we're kind of shifting in our model of personality disorders, we're starting to see that these traits, these behaviors that people engage in, could be adaptive and flexible responses to change, which, as you all know, when the environment changes, we tend to adapt. And without these defenses that we have, we would be highly vulnerable to a lot of constant emotional input. And so with the overload, instead of feeling constantly overwhelmed, I have these defense mechanisms that I use, for example. An example of this would be someone who, doesn't like getting text messages all the time. That actually, I will be sometimes slow to respond to text just because I don't want to feel overwhelmed, right? And so I will put things like text messages to the side until I can get to them and deal with them. And so we do things like that in order to avoid feeling overwhelmed. And so that's a silly one, but there are lots of ways that we can defend against this emotional vulnerability that we may have. So healthy defense mechanisms. This one kind of just as an example of a child. So growing up with a mother or father who hoards or keeps an extremely messy house. Let's just say that a kid that grows up and never kind of had a clean home, always was embarrassed and frustrated that he could never find anything, and super embarrassed when his friends came over. So as a defense growing up, maybe the child learned to become extremely organized and very clean, right? So their room became impeccable, schoolwork was always completed and neat, and they carried this into adulthood. And so now everything has to be just so. And so the defense mechanism as a child is something that is functional, and then looking at how that carries into adulthood. So, excuse me, the defense mechanisms that we, so sorry, that we can develop as children can be immature, right? Because little kids are going to find any way possible to be able to deal with the stresses of life. So for a kid that's in that hyperarousal state, They might start to throw a tantrum, for example, to get their own way. The mentality of I'll take my ball and go home. And so they really start to, they learn that if I throw a fit, then you're going to be able to give me what I want. And as a child, when the world is unpredictable, this can be a very functional way of navigating the environment. But when these behaviors continue into adulthood, and when we use these defenses in adulthood, it usually doesn't work that well. So when you throw a temper tantrum at work and use those defense mechanisms that you learned early in childhood, it's not going to work so well. People are not going to be accepting of that in your workplace, for example. And so looking at these patterns that develop early on as ways to protect ourselves, they become maladaptive as we grow up and as we become adults. So I'm going to skip just a little bit ahead and kind of come here, and I'm going to rewind just a little bit to make sure that you're tracking, because I know that this is a lot of information to get, and I want you to just kind of take a pause and think about this, because it really is important to understand how we get to ways of interacting with other people that may not be as helpful, right? So a lot of characteristics that professionals have can be great and wonderful. And then when we take them to the extreme and we get into places to where they become maladaptive, what is happening in that and what leads to that? That's really important for us to understand. So we're gonna really look at and kind of peel back the layers of this onion. Okay, we're gonna look at how these personality disorders kind of play this role, which leads to the defense, and then really what's underneath and what the person is protecting underneath. And I want to kind of step back and use and just kind of give you a clinical example so that you can understand really what we're talking about. And the example is someone, an attorney who's been practicing for many, many years, starts to have problems at work, getting in confrontations with people, fighting with people, not being able to get feedback when there are problems, kind of getting ahead of himself and not working with other people. And so going to work and really becoming a tyrant at work, where others are not able and not able to connect and join with him. Now, most people in those moments at work, they just want to walk away. They want to throw their hands in the air and say, I can't deal with this guy. I can't deal with this lady. She's out of control. And what I want to encourage you today to look at is that there's something underneath all of those behaviors, right? When someone is engaging in those extreme coping mechanisms or defense mechanisms, there's really something underneath that behavior. There's a defense that's coming up. There's a reason that they need to defend themselves. Just like that little kid who became a neat freak was really defending the emotions that they felt from a childhood. We start to engage and use these patterns when we feel uncomfortable, when we feel hyper aroused. And these defenses can really interfere and hurt our relationships. So as we peel back the onion, this person we're going to look at how it goes into the roles that we play, the defense mechanisms that we use, and then the underlying emotion. And so we're going to look at these 5 different types of personality. So we're going to look at narcissism, antisocial, borderline, dependent, and obsessive compulsive. And I want you guys to look less at the label. So you know narcissism. You've all dealt with people who are narcissistic, and I want us to start to learn to look at through the lens of seeing how these behaviors have become developmentally safe for them, but then also what they're protecting, which I think also helps us better understand and relate to these individuals, whether that's someone you know, or it's someone, or it's yourself, right? So looking first here at narcissism, there are many different types of roles that people who have narcissistic personality can play. The first being someone who bullies, right? They can be a tyrant, they can bully, they can be a know-it-all, But they can really, if you just stop at the behaviors, they can really be difficult to deal with. And like I said before, most people don't want to deal with them. They want to back away. They want to say, go do something else because I'm not dealing with you. But they want to engage and find a way to be superior to you because they feel inadequate underneath. And so the defenses that they use, so kind of peeling back the layer, the defenses that they use are ways to compensate for feeling weak. And so they'll use behaviors like devaluation. Okay, so a person with narcissism, because they feel inadequate, right? They're going to devalue what you're doing and what you're thinking. So they'll use name calling. They'll use demeaning or disrespectful language or put you down. Your idea is stupid. What you're doing is stupid. Your whole family is stupid. They just want any way that they can to feel superior to you. And that is a safety mechanism. It's a defense that they use in their relationships. The other one is externalization. And externalization, that defense, what that is they find a way to blame anything other than themselves. So if we're disagreeing about something, they'll turn the tables on you and say, well, you shouldn't have done this. It's all your fault. And you did this and you did that. Or this computer flawed. And so it's the computer's fault. They'll find anything outside of themselves to blame so that they don't have to take any responsibility. And so when you look at it, again, those behaviors can be like running fingernails down a chalkboard, right? They're really annoying because you want them to just look at their behaviors. But they struggle to do that. A person that's using a narcissistic defense struggles to do that because they feel so insecure underneath it all. And so what are they protecting? What is someone with narcissistic personality disorder protecting? They're protecting fear, because underneath it all, they really fear being seen. They fear being less than. They fear not being good enough, not smart enough. And when you look at people and you work with people who struggle with narcissistic personality disorder, this is something that is critical to be able to understand. You believe on some level, because of the way they present, that they feel super powerful. But underneath all the bravado, right, is this fear of you actually seeing the weakness that they always feel that they have. And so they use all of these behaviors in order to protect, in order to not be hurt. And so the narcissistic defenses really block them, or block you from being able to see what they're feeling, which is really fear. Okay, so that's narcissism. Next, we're going to move to antisocial. And sometimes people think antisocial is just someone who doesn't like to be social. And we're not talking about somebody who doesn't like to be social. We're talking about people who like to break the rules, right? They like to reject authority. They will go around authority. They don't have any remorse for what they do. And they will kind of fight the system. They're really good at fighting systems and fighting with people. So the antisocial, let's kind of step back and look at, when you look at an antisocial, what are you seeing in the relationship? You're seeing someone who really rebels, who rejects rules and uses deceit and manipulation to get what they want. They don't care about what you're needing, or they appear to not care what you're needing, and they just want to get what they want. And they'll go around anything and do anything in order to manipulate to get that to happen. The second one is the aggressor. The antisocial, these are people that can be quick to fight, quick to use aggression with verbal aggression. They're going to take a one-up position over people in order to feel safe in relationships. And so you'll see them engage as the aggressor oftentimes in relationships. And it's like, whoa, where did that come from? And so that's the roles that you see the antisocial personalities play. So as we peel back, what are the defenses, right? So where are these coming from? And the first one that they'll use, the defense mechanism that they use, is acting out. So instead of saying, I'm angry with you or I'm upset with you, this person will use aggressive acts, right, to intimidate you or to push you back on your heels. So things such as throwing objects, punching walls, doing things that are going to make you back away. So that the defense can be an acting out behavior. The other one that's really strong for antisocials is dissociation. And that's one of the things that when you look at people with antisocial, they're able to dissociate from caring about other people. And so they don't feel the empathy when they hurt someone. They don't worry about how someone else is going to feel. And so that's protective for them because they're hurting people, right? They're being aggressive with you. And so their ability to kind of dissociate from those emotions that you may feel is really kind of central to that antisocial defense and how they engage with other people. So what on earth would antisocials be protecting? And underneath all of the behaviors that an antisocial engages in, there's a lot of anger oftentimes underneath. And when you look at histories of people who have antisocial personality, they usually really grow up in households where they were abused as children, any kind of abuse. They weren't heard as a child. And so when they had a need or a want or a desire, they were just told to what on earth would antisocials be protecting? And underneath all of the behaviors that an antisocial engages in, there's a lot of anger oftentimes underneath. And when you look at histories of people who have antisocial personality, they usually really grow up in households where they were abused as children, any kind of abuse. They weren't heard as a child. And so when they had a need or a want or a desire, they were just told to shut up, to get over it. I don't care what you have to say. I'm the mom, I'm the dad, go to your room, leave me alone. And so they didn't feel like they could have a voice as a child. And so not being able to be heard obviously is very frustrating, and it feels constantly being shut down leads to those feelings of anger and frustration. Not allowed to set or have boundaries. So if I say as a kid, if I'm upset about something and say no to something, I'm kind of slapped around and told to get over myself, and that I can't say no and I have to do whatever you tell me to. And then being overly controlled. One of the things that I'll tell people, if you want to make a really good liar out of a kid, then overreact to them all the time, right? Control every move that they make. Make sure that they will learn how to lie and manipulate to get around that. Because kids they need some independence, right? They need to be able to grow and make decisions. And when kids don't feel like they have any say in things and don't feel like they can say no or have a voice, then that leads to a lot of anger. And what ends up happening is they go behind your back and start acting out those behaviors. And so those defenses where, they become the bully on the playground, and then as adults, they engage in other behaviors that are going to become rejecting and hurtful and harmful to others. And so underneath all of that, it's not about, I think sometimes with antisocials, we just write them off as the criminals. But really, as children, they were not heard and they were not seen. And when working with antisocials or dealing with antisocials, sometimes it's just really helpful just to listen to their point of view and hear them out, and work with them from that perspective. So next is dependent. Dependent individuals, these are very clingy individuals, and they can really, they rely on you for decisions. So not a lot of attorneys are dependent, but you may know some dependent personalities. They want others to make decisions for them. They feel very insecure about making decisions independently. And so dependent personality can kind of be the shadow or the person that clings to you constantly and needs that reassurance from you all the time. And so what are the roles that people play as a dependent personality? These are things such as the victim. They play the victim really, really, really well. And I don't know if you guys have heard of the Cartman triangle. If you haven't, I highly recommend, if there's any couples work that needs to be done in your life, the Cartman triangle really is a helpful tool to use. But the Cartman triangle has three different points, obviously: the rescuer, perpetrator, and victim. And one of the things that oftentimes helps people understand the victim is that they grow up in homes where they have very dedicated rescuers. They have people who are going to go and do and fix everything and anything for them. And so the victim never really learns how to navigate problems. They don't learn how to deal with struggles. So an example of this is someone who kind of has a Disneyland upbringing where mom and dad, anytime there's a problem, they run to the school and they fix it for them. They make a bad grade, they go yell at the teacher. They didn't make the football team, they're going to go yell at the coach because you're not going to hurt my child. And so looking at how that victim, the child, learns that I can't take care of things myself. I need somebody else to protect me. And they then start to rely on and not feel confident in any of their decisions and not able to get things met or done as an adult. So the defenses that they use, they're there to protect against those feelings of anxiety, but they use avoidance. So they will avoid for as long as the day, or for as long as they possibly can. They'll avoid making decisions about their own life because they're fearful that they're going to make the wrong one. And so they just avoid. Even though it's making the problem worse, they'll avoid at all costs. Another defense that they'll use is isolation. And so they'll pull off, and because they feel rejected or don't want to feel rejected. And so they choose to avoid the closeness and connection and relationships out of fear. And so that is what they end up protecting. They feel really insecure. They grew up, like I said, with the dedicated rescuers, and they never learned how to navigate those problems in life. And so underneath it all, they feel inadequate. They feel like a failure. And so they need to protect these emotions, and they end up engaging in these really defective ways or patterns in relationships. The obsessive compulsive. These I will say, attorneys, professionals in general, this is a common one. This is one that a lot of professionals engage in, and there's a lot of function for professionals that have obsessive compulsive traits, because what these are, it's a little bit of perfectionism, right? It's a degree of wanting to get it right, wanting to follow the letter of the law, to not mess anything up, which again, as a professional, these traits can be very functional and can look really good. And any law school that you go to is going to love the most obsessive compulsive law students. But what happens in adulthood is that the obsessive compulsive personality doesn't work out so well because you end up in these roles with people and using this defense to avoid actually engaging in the relationship. And so some of the roles that obsessive compulsive personality play, they play the overachiever, where they've learned to do everything perfect in order to get attention, to have positive validation coming, which every one of us loves validation. That's a human quality. We love to get validation. But when I feel dependent on it, that I have to get things perfect or else. So I will work 150 hours a week in order to make sure that all my I's are dotted and all my T's are crossed, and nobody can find anything wrong with anything I've done. And so how that can become debilitating for professionals. And then the perfectionist is very, very similar, demanding that all things are perfect at all times in order to avoid judgment and fear. And I've seen this in professionals for many years. They're like, well, what else do you want me to do? And the thing is that with perfectionism, you live in fear, right? You live in fear of being wrong, as opposed to really striving for excellence or trying to just do things well, which there's a lot of freedom in that way of thinking. But the perfectionism is really a role that people get stuck in, especially as professionals. And so those two things can be very debilitating for professionals. And so the defenses that obsessive compulsive personalities end up using, they use a lot of rationalization, attempts to explain or create excuses for events or behaviors. They want to think their way out of anything and avoid the emotion, which is also the second one, the intellectualization. They block emotion at all costs. I'll explain it. I'll tell you exactly what I think about it, but I'm not going to tell you what I'm feeling. And so they end up engaging in a lot of those defenses. And so what is the obsessive compulsive personality protecting? And I think really underneath, oftentimes, there's a lot of shame and anxiety with obsessive compulsive personality, where growing up, the emotional needs were not met. They didn't feel seen as a child. And they were often given messages that they were not or will never be enough. And so the only way that they felt enough was to kind of go into this overachiever role, to where they could perform to get the validation that they needed. So underneath all of that is this feeling of incompetence, and that they're never going to be enough. You guys may have heard of the imposter syndrome. A lot of professionals struggle with the imposter syndrome, and just that feeling that it's never going to be enough. I'm never going to be enough. And so that shame and anxiety that's at the core, the obsessive compulsive behaviors become a way to defend against those feelings, which is not helpful. And then borderline personality. Most people are very familiar and have heard of borderline personality. I think really borderline gets a bad rap because a lot of times people have very negative connotations of what that means. But borderline personality disorder, they often use defenses of splitting or projection. And they struggle to see things in a whole. So they will use very, very black and white thinking. So when they're interacting with you, for example, they see things as very black and white, and they can't see the gray in situations or with people. They also project, so the feelings of what they're feeling, they will attribute to other people because they're uncomfortable with what they're feeling, and then they project that on other people. And so that becomes the defense in which they use. Some roles that borderline personality play, they can end up playing the identified patient. Oftentimes in the family or in families, they become the person that's always out of control, always sick, always got something wrong, and people just roll their eyes at them. And so the family will kind of use that, or that they will use that chaos to express the problems in the family. Another role is a pot stirrer, which we all know what a pot stirrer is. So they can be the person that's going to constantly be stirring things up, even though they don't have anything to do with the situation. They want to get the emotional chaos going. And then the scapegoat. People with borderline personality disorder, they've struggled most of their lives, or have struggled all of their lives, and they end up kind of being that person that gets blamed for everything. And so they can become the scapegoat in relationships. Well, here she goes again, and he goes again. And so that becomes the role that they end up playing in the relationship. And what's underneath all of that? There's oftentimes a ton of pain. Borderline personality disorder, the most research comes when you look at trauma. Not every person with borderline has trauma, but you can see usually a very, very extensive history of trauma with abuse, physical, sexual, emotional, verbal, anything and everything, and the family environment not being stable, right? And so the person with the borderline traits, they learn to kind of cope with these ways of interacting with others, where they become emotionally labile, they use cutting, all these behaviors in order to pull people close, and which ends up hurting them and the relationship. And so you can see in each of these, I love this movie, but you can see in each of these patterns that underneath personality, oftentimes there is a lot of emotional dysregulation. So when people are engaging in relationships in ways that are not helpful, and they're at those extreme ends of normal, we are using those behaviors in order to protect ourselves. And that's one of the things that I don't think a lot of people get that struggle with personality disorders themselves, or that have someone that they know or love that has a personality. They oftentimes they just kind of write those people off, as opposed to trying to understand that these behaviors that they're engaging in, whether it's an ego, or it's using control and perfectionism, they're using those things to protect from the pain that they feel underneath. And I think that when you look at these slides here, I pulled Inside Out film. I don't know if you guys have seen that movie. It is really one that I highly, highly, highly recommend for people. And in therapy, we'll have people take that movie home. You need to go watch Inside Out so that they can understand it. It's childlike for children, but to help people understand that these emotions can end up driving the bus. And when they are driving the bus and we're in that hyper aroused state, that's when we're engaging in these patterns that are harmful for us. And you can learn how to deal with the emotions and what's happening internally so that you don't need these other behaviors that are hurting the relationships. And so learning how to appropriately use the emotions as opposed to letting them drive the bus. So when we look at interrupting these personality traits, I think a lot of times when you live with or work with a person with a personality, this can be very overwhelming because the personality traits tend to kind of take over the relationship. Most people, when dealing with individuals with personality disorders, they kind of back away. But that's not always possible, right? We have to sometimes learn how to interact and to be around and to cope with individuals that have these struggles. And if you have these struggles, or if you know someone who does, I think that these are some really important things to consider as you look at how to possibly interrupt these patterns. So the first one is trying to understand the function of the behavior. So going back to what we looked at and walked through with those different personalities, what is that behavior protecting the person from feeling? So if they feel the fear or they feel shame or anxiety, those behaviors are playing that function, right? They're playing a role. And we have to be able to understand that in order to be able to interrupt it. And I think it's always helpful when working with people with personality or these struggles with personality to understand the developmental perspective that people don't wake up this way. They didn't just decide to become an arrogant jerk and when they became an attorney or when they ended up in a certain job. They've lived this life their entire life. And there's a reason and a developmental reason as to why these behaviors have become protective for them. And so having empathy and connecting to that can be really helpful when working with individuals and interacting with people with personality. I think also in terms of understanding the function, really understanding the fears is a really important question to ask around personality. Because when you understand what a person fears about giving up, right? So if I use my narcissism in order for you to not see my weaknesses, right? That means I'm really, really fearful of you seeing me as weak. And so why is that? What would it mean if I messed up? And kind of going back to one of those earlier slides that I used about fear of failure, right? That's a big one for professionals. And so we'll use lots of ways to protect ourselves from feeling that sense of failure. We'll work really hard to avoid that because we have such fear around failure. And so we have to understand what role these behaviors are playing for us that are protecting us in feeling the fears. And then what would it mean to let the behavior go? If I am using my arrogance to protect me, and that's the only way that I know how to feel adequate in a relationship, that some of the questions that I have to ask myself is what would it mean if I didn't have to be in a one-up position in the relationship? What does that mean about me? And that's oftentimes what we try to help people look at in treatment is helping them see that I don't have to be one up or one down in a relationship. I can be equal with you and we can work together as opposed to me having to fight tooth and nail for me to be in this one-up position over you. And so helping people see that to interrupt these things, we have to understand the function underneath and we have to understand what we're protecting that we end up doing these behaviors. I think going back to this window of tolerance, I want to hit it one more time just to help people see that, when we get into this hyperarousal state is when we go to these places that are not so functional. And I think when you think about a child, for example, when you think about a kid, the other day, there was a mom telling me a story about her child. She had asked him to empty something and he was refusing to do it. And she gave him some feedback on what he was actually doing. And he threw the dish, broke it into a million pieces. And, in that state, he felt overwhelmed and unable to cope, right? And so he used a really reactive way of expressing that emotion, as opposed to being able to contain, being able to take a deep breath, and being able to work within that window of tolerance. To be able to function, that is our best place, is in that window of tolerance. And we can do lots of techniques to be able to help us stay there. You've probably heard ad nauseum as lawyers with all the CLE courses to do your mindfulness and to do your self-care. But that's how you stay in that window of tolerance, is by taking good care of yourself and making sure that you're not overly stressed and can handle the emotions that are going to come with life. Also working with defenses, just a few more things here. The first one being therapy. Anybody that struggles with these personality characteristics, one of the first things that we want anybody to understand is that it's there for a reason, and you can get therapy. Outpatient therapy is wonderful. Individual therapy, EMDR, is a great way to get at some of those developmental perspectives, to look at the traumas underneath. But there are ways to interrupt that and to understand what's happening so that you don't have to continue to rely on those maladaptive patterns. And so making sure that in those processes that you get that trauma addressed as to whatever reason can be driving the bus for that emotional reactivity. And lastly, not to get in a hurry, right? To be patient with yourself. Oftentimes, for personality, these behaviors get so ingrained. It's who we are. And I think oftentimes when people start to realize, oh, that's what I look like when I do that, that's what I'm coming across as, they really start to want to hurry the process up and get better. And it takes time. You're going to struggle. Anybody who's working on these patterns is going to struggle because they've been a characteristic that's been protective for many, many years in a person's life. And so we're taking that defense away, and you're going to learn a healthy defense, as opposed to something that's going to be hurtful for your relationships. This last slide is one of the t-shirts that one of our peers got a long time ago. But it says, "I used to have superhuman powers, but my therapist took them away," which I think is really funny. In treatment and in therapy, oftentimes it feels like when you're removing these defense mechanisms, that these superpowers are being taken away, because you're losing those things that have been protective. But when you learn and you replace them with healthy ways of interacting, you no longer need those protective ways, and can really engage in relationships in a much better way that's going to allow you to feel close, that's going to allow you to feel connected and have intimacy in relationships, as opposed to just kind of reacting and acting. So that's all I have. Does anyone have any questions?
We've got some comments. Thank you, Dr. Bennett. This is very helpful. What a terrific presentation. And I've gotten several texts like that. And I encourage anyone to type in a comment if they would like to make one. But maybe they're all just kind of stunned like I am, because I kept seeing myself in all the things you were talking about. And I only got a little comfort when you mentioned the imposter syndrome, because I heard Justice Sotomayor in an interview, and she said that was a big problem for her throughout her career, even after she was on the Supreme Court. So,
right.
It's
so true. I mean, like it happens. And the thing is learning how to get underneath of those things, as opposed to it's okay, right?
Yep. Yeah, we have several really nice comments on the on your Q&A. I encourage you to look at those, Dr. Bennett.
Okay.
Also, will you be providing your slides to be shared?
Absolutely. I would be very happy to do that. I'll email them to you, and they can be sent to whoever, wherever.
Okay. If anybody posts a question, Dan McDermott, please keep a look. I'm just going to comment on a few things that have been commonly texted to me or sent to me today, which if you are on today, your time on the site and in the presentation is being recorded electronically. So we know you are here. Don't worry if you have to run off for a court appearance or something. We have the time that you did attend. It's up to you to report to the Florida Bar accurately. Of course, our participants are required to attend today. So I don't expect they'll be signing off. I think that's a primary question we've been seeing.
John, there is a question that asks, please revisit the slide with tables with personalities and defenses again after discussing all 4 personalities. Is that something we could do?
It was right before.
Yeah.
There we go.
So this is just kind of an overview of what I went through, and looks at the different roles and the defense mechanisms, kind of peeling back the onion. And I think, like I said, so many people with personality, they get stuck with, I have a personality disorder, and they see the problems, but they really don't understand that it's just a defense. And I really hope that people can understand that. It doesn't mean that something's pathologically wrong with you. Like at your core, you're just trying to protect yourself from getting hurt, which as a child, we want to protect ourselves from getting hurt. So it's a functional defense that we learned, and we can unlearn. We can learn healthier ways to defend ourselves without using these mechanisms that end up hurting ourselves.
That's great. There's another question. What treatment exists for personality disorders you mentioned on your presentation?
Yeah, so the treatment, therapy in general, just individual therapy, works wonders for people. Often when I showed the hyperarousal for the window of tolerance, people that kind of live in that hyperarousal state, dialectical behavioral therapy is a great intervention. There are lots of outpatient therapists that do that. So it's also can just be referred to as DBT. So that's some treatment that I think would be very helpful if you struggle with kind of being able to tolerate emotions and end up doing behaviors that end up hurting you. So there's that, then EMDR and any kind of trauma work that's going to get underneath. Because when you think about if you treat the trauma, and that kind of diminishes, then you don't feel so fragile underneath, and then you won't rely on these defense mechanisms as much. And so treating the trauma can also be very central. And then, if anybody ever wanted to come to PEP and join me for a couple of weeks, if you wanted some intensive intervention, we treat this. There's a place in Kansas, Lawrence, Kansas, PRC does a great job. So I'm sure John knows all the resources for places that do the personality treatment.
Thank you. In response to another question, we will have the slides after the presentation, and we'll make them available to anybody who'd like them. And there was a final request to see the slide with the cars in the parking lot again.
Oh yeah. This is one of my faves. You can find them all on there.
And I just wanted to note that I am unmuted. Okay. I just posted in the chat to everyone and podcast that Dr. Bennett was on talking about taming disruptive behavior. So I believe Dr. Bennett, at least when I was working in treatment, the disruptives we had were people who smashed the phone in their law firm about every 3 months or screamed at staff or threw things around and were really difficult to work with. people who need a little resilience.
Yes, yes, they're outside their window of tolerance, right?
Yeah. So we posted that in the chat. Please feel free to look. And all these presentations, the videos will be posted in about a week or 10 days, probably. It'll just take us a minute to get it done, but it will be posted on the FLA website, and you will be able to go watch one presentation at a time. So you won't have to watch the whole 5 hours or find your way through. You'll be able to watch. And with that, again, Dr. Bennett, thank you for donating your time.
Absolutely.
So generous of you. We really, really appreciate it. Thanks for doing all the great work. Of course, happy to have you as a treatment resource and have a lot of experience with the work you do. So thanks very much.
Y'all have a great day. Thank you.